Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Anna, and on behalf of all of us behind the scenes here at Virtual Force Space, thank you for joining us on Facebook and Zoom today for the 5th episode in a 6-part lunchtime series of presentations and conversations focused on questions of sustainability across disciplines. Today, you'll hear 2 brief presentations from Steffi Veloso and Dr. Jaeger. As Zoom attendees, we encourage you to ask questions throughout in the Q&A feature, and our moderator, Dr. Rebecca Titler, will address them after the presentations. You can also raise your hand during the question period and be allowed to speak if you choose. For those of you following along on our Facebook page, go ahead and comment below the video, and we'll be sure to relay your comments and questions into the Zoom. It is now my pleasure to invite Amy Potit to introduce today's session. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Anna. So today's session is one of a series of 6 webinars that are an outgrowth of our Sustainability Across Disciplines conference, co-sponsored by the Loyola Center for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. We were to have a conference on March 16th through 18th, just a few days before after everything shut down for the pandemic. So we had to cancel the in-person conference, but we've been able to, with the support of Fourth Space, at least save some of the presentations so that we can share them with you today, tomorrow, last week, and yesterday. So thank you very much for showing up. I'm now going to hand things over to Jochen Jaeger, who is not only a presenter today, but also the supervisor of our first presenter, Steffi Veloso, and he is also the former co-director with myself of the Sustainability Research Center. Over to you, Jochen.
Thank you so much, Amy, for your kind words. It's a great pleasure to introduce Steffi Veloso. She will present first. She's an honors student in our Department of Geography, Planning and Environment. And she took my class in landscape ecology in winter 2019. And then she did fieldwork in our lab last summer doing road mortality surveys, supported by a CUSRA, which is a Concordia undergraduate research award. And then she went on to analyze her data in her honors thesis in fall 2019 and winter and spring 2020. And the title of her thesis is Death by 1,000 Cars, Road Mortality and the Need for Road Mitigation Measures along Autoroute 10 in southern Quebec. And please go ahead, Steffi, and present your work.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Jaeger. I will start screen sharing now. Just confirmation that we can see my slides. Perfect. So as Dr. Jaeger said, I am an honors student going into my last semester, and we've been working together for over a year now on our project alongside a nonprofit organization known as Corridor Appalachiens. They work on connectivity and habitat conservation projects along Highway 10. So we work very closely with them. And without further ado, there we are. So since this is a road ecology presentation, I just give a light warning that there will be some Carcass photos in my slides, but fear not, it's mostly PG stuff, just a little heads up. Unsurprisingly, roads are one of the most widespread wildlife disturbances in North America. They act as barriers which block animal movement and limit their access to important resources and habitat. Roads and traffic also significantly increase mortality rates in wildlife populations, while wildlife vehicle collisions are also a huge safety concern. In fact, a study showed that there are 4 to 8 vehicle collisions involving large mammals every hour in Canada. Given this context, our research aimed to answer the following 4 questions. Firstly, what is the most effective protocol for collecting road mortality data along Highway 10 while adhering to the work permit regulations imposed by the Ministry of Transport of Quebec? Second, are there any road mortality hotspots along the sections of interest? Third, how are road mortality hotspots related to the proposed wildlife corridors? And lastly, how do the results of the Concordia research team following a rigorous data collection protocol compare to the results of a more sporadic data collection by the Transport Ministry? So our study took place along Highway 10. The highway connects the cities of Montreal and Sherbrooke. More specifically, the study area was between the towns of Bromont and Magog, as this is the area identified by Corridor Appalachiens as being the priority site for mitigation. A closer look at the survey sections. So the survey area was divided into 6 sections. Section A, B, and C would be driving towards Sherbrooke, while sections D, E, and F were driving towards Montreal. The purple area here on the road indicates an extension to our permit. So after 2 survey sessions in the month of May, we realized that we could add a little bit more area to cover. And so we added this to our permit and started surveying that area as well in June. So we do have less data for those areas. We were first tasked with designing a standardized data collection protocol which adhered to the permit restrictions imposed by the Ministry of Transport of Quebec, and that could also be closely followed for subsequent years. Data collection took place from mid-May to the end of August of 2019, and we completed 8 survey sessions lasting 10 days each. For the first 5 days, we would survey in the morning, 30 minutes after sunrise. We would then switch to evening surveys, aiming to be finished 30 minutes before sunset. We drove in the emergency lane at 30 kilometers an hour with 2 observers looking for carcasses. If a potential data point was spotted, the driver would pull the car over safely, and the 2 observers would exit the vehicle to take a closer look. We used indexes, such as the one seen in the photo here, to identify the species of the animal and take GPS coordinates. If we were unable to identify the species, we would take measurements and photos and send the information along to Corridor Appalachiens, and the biologist would further analyze the animal photos. Finally, if possible, we would remove the carcasses from the road. Otherwise, we would spray paint to a line in line with the carcass to prevent double counting on future surveys. So we also work with data collected by the Ministry of Transport of Quebec. They don't purposefully look for roadkill, but if they come across it on their way to another job, or if they see roadkill is obscuring the road or get a call about it, they will pull over and take a GPS coordinate. They will then either remove the carcass immediately or flag it for later removal. So over the span of 4 months, the Concordia research team, or the CRT for short, found a total of 212 animals. The Ministry of Transport of Quebec, or the MTQ, found a total of 64, and 15 of those animals were found by both the CRT and the MTQ. So here is the species distribution by group. The Concordia research team found mostly medium mammals, followed by birds, small mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and large mammals. The Ministry of Transport also found mostly medium-sized and then large mammals, finding very little of the other categories. This is unsurprising because, as I mentioned, they're driving at high speed, so it would be difficult to detect animals of this size. In total, the CRT found 49 species, while the MTQ found 8. So here's the distribution of species found by the Concordia research team. All large mammals that we found were white-tailed deer, so they're not represented in these graphs. While we were expecting to find species such as raccoons and porcupines, we were surprised to find other species such as ermines, fishers, river otters, and woodland turtles that are either rare or endangered in the area. This is the distribution of bird species found. So as you can see, there were only 1 or 2 of most of the species, and a lot more for the American goldfinch, red-winged blackbird, and cedar waxwing. We were also able to determine if they were adult or juvenile in the case of birds, so that's what the different colors represent. And the unknown category is quite large in this group, simply because a lot of them were on the left side of the road and we were unable to enter the lanes or approach that side of the road. So we compared the species found killed on the road to species observed using existing crossing structures in previous studies that were completed by our lab. These studies actually took place in the same study area that we conducted the mortality surveys. We excluded birds from this analysis as it is highly unlikely that they would use water culverts and train or road underpasses to cross the highway. Interestingly, 16 of the 29 non-bird species we observed were also found using the structures. we can see that ermines and martins, as well as all species of frogs and turtles, were found on the road, but were not seen using the structures. This indicates that some species may not be inclined to approach such structures, but may still be found in the area. Furthermore, more research is needed to encourage the use of crossing structures by all local species. Overall, the CRT found 4 times more animals than the MTQ. So here's an example of the carcass distribution in section B and E, which is the section that had the largest proportion of roadkill. These purple areas here represent proposed wildlife corridors that have been identified by Corridor Appalachiens. So these are passages that are assumed to be used by animals for movement. And here, kilometer 101 to 14, we see the extended area. So the left is what the CRT found, and the right is the MTQ. We were interested in comparing the road sections which intersected proposed wildlife corridors to those that did not. To do so, we divided the road into segments of both 250 and 500 meters and compared the amount of roadkill between the 2 types of segments. At both scales, the average number of animals on road segments intersecting wildlife corridors was greater than the average number of animals on road segments that did not. We ran further statistical analysis, however, the results were insignificant. This indicates that these wildlife corridors may potentially be correctly located. However, more data is needed for further evaluation. Next, we ran a hotspot analysis using Siriema. So Siriema is an online software that you can download. The user uploads the road segments of interest along with the mortality events. Siriema randomly redistributes the roadkill events along the specified stretch of road in a chosen number of simulations. So we chose 1,000 for each run of the software. This is what an output of Siriema looks like, along with, of course, Excel files. Ultimately, Siriema compares the random distribution from the simulations to the actual distribution of roadkill that is found. If there is clustering of roadkill in areas that is unlikely to have occurred by chance, this is considered a hotspot. If there is a lack of clustering that is unlikely to have occurred by chance, this is considered a cold spot. These 2 lines here represent the confidence interval, where the blue line is above the confidence interval is indicative of a hotspot, whereas where it is below is indicative of a cold spot. So with that in mind, here's an overview of the hotspots found in the entire study area at the 500-meter scale. At this scale, there was a total of 8 hotspots and 6 cold spots. At the 50-meter scale, there were 25 hotspots and 1 cold spot. So here's section A and F. This is the section that is closest to Bromo. The hotspot locations varied at the 2 scales quite greatly, as you can see here. And there was only a cold spot identified at the 500-meter scale. This demonstrates the importance of testing at different scales, since hotspots and cold spots do vary. Interestingly, the cold spot is actually found right inside the proposed wildlife corridor. This may be indicative that it is incorrectly placed, and perhaps this would explain the insignificant results of the wildlife corridor analysis. However, with only 1 summer's worth of data, we can't make any definitive conclusions, especially since the correspondence of hotspots and wildlife corridors is disputed in the literature. Similarly, we cannot conclude that there was nothing in this extended area, as we did have less data. So here's section B and E again. They are surprisingly similar at both scales. As you can see, the hotspots more or less correspond at both the 50 and 500 meters. Here we can see the largest hotspot identified, which was around kilometer 95.5, which in this case is right in the middle of a proposed wildlife corridor. The ministry had actually proposed a fence from kilometer 90 to 96, which is from about here till about halfway through this hotspot. And this would actually include 3 cold spots and only half of the large hotspot as mentioned. So based on these findings, this fence would be more valuable a little bit further along the highway. However, since these results are only from 1 summer, more data is needed to make definitive recommendations about fence and crossing structure locations. However, the ministry has halted its plans to build the fence along these areas. Finally, here we have section C and D. The hotspots are mostly located inside the proposed wildlife corridor, and there is no cold spot at either scale in this case. So to fence all the hotspots at the 500-meter scale, it would take a total of 11 kilometers of fencing. And this is the scale that would be of most interest to the ministry, since it is more suitable for large mammals that we want to avoid having collisions with. The significance of this research is to persuade the MTQ to go forth with their interests and actually build road mitigations along Highway 10. Excitingly, there is also starting to be talk about constructing a wildlife crossing bridge, which would be the first of its kind in Quebec. We want to suggest the most effective locations for fencing and crossing structures. In order to do this, the ministry has actually funded another year of data collection to effectively be able to make suggestions about where mitigation should be prioritized. And they're actually doing data collection as we speak in the same study area. Finally, we hope that this project will be part of the BACI study, so that's before, after, control, impact. We would require 2 years of data collection prior to the installation of mitigation measures, followed by 2 years of data after the installation. All of the data collection would follow the same standardized protocol, which is why its design was so important to this research. And this would allow us to make direct comparisons of the before and after data to evaluate the effectiveness of the mitigation measures. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, la Fondation de la Faune du Québec, our partners at Corridor Appalachiens, and the Ministry of Transport for their collaboration. I would also like to thank my research assistants, Anna Krupa and Sabrina Mruchak, for their pivotal role in supporting the project, and of course, Dr. Jaeger for his continued supervision. Finally, thank you so much for your attention, and do you have any questions?
Thank you, Steffi. That was great. Very informative and well-designed study. I have a question right away from the audience, which is, were the wildlife cameras set up to capture reptiles and amphibians?
So reptiles and amphibians are difficult to capture in the wildlife cameras because they use infrared, so we don't pick them up as much. We did have some wildlife cameras still going, but most of the wildlife camera data collection was actually done before the road mortality, and now they've reinstalled the cameras, so now they're continuing it again. But yes, it is hard for the cameras to capture reptiles and amphibians, so that's definitely part of the reason why we don't see them.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the panel or from the audience before we move on to our second presentation? Okay, if you think of questions that you have, yes, Amy? Sorry, just saw your hand, go ahead.
I just put my hand up. So I'm wondering, since you're talking about having monitoring 2 years before and 2 years after the intervention, has it been possible to continue the monitoring this year? Is this, because given the pandemic situation, are you able as a team to continue, or is this affecting things at all? Thank you. Oh, and wonderful presentation. I'm eager to get my question out, but wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. So yes, the research team was a little bit delayed. So a master's student has now taken on the project. They were a little bit delayed in the month of May, so they ended up starting later than they had intended. They wanted to start right away, and I think they started third week in. So unfortunately, that will affect data a little bit, but they are out there now, and they were able to reinstall the cameras as well as continue with the road surveys. So they're doing, they're living out in Bromo right now and doing the road surveys on 10-day sessions, the same as us. So there will be, we haven't lost data, and the traffic also was actually surprisingly still high. So our data won't be compromised due to that either. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Steffi. If anybody else has any more questions, maybe you can save them to the end because we are running a little bit close on time. So I'd like to invite Professor Joachim Jaeger to share his screen and take over from here.
Does this work? Can you see my screen? Good. So the question is then, when you have those hotspots identified, what do you do next? So what are the mitigation measures and where do you start? Like among all the mitigation measures available, some are even better than fencing, but they're very, very expensive, like putting the road underground or having them on pillars. So fencing really is, among the realistic measures, the most important one. So the question then is, where are wildlife fences needed most urgently? And I'm actually presenting the work by a student Ariel Spanovic, she is now doing her master's thesis in Zurich at ETH there, so she couldn't present herself, and we collaborated with the postdoc researcher Fernanda Teixeira from Brazil. So where are the wildlife fences needed most urgently? There are many situations, well, 5 and most importantly, so I will only talk about one of these situations, and that's the situation when there is a roadkill hotspot on the road, because there you can effectively reduce road mortality. And that's where I will focus on this question. And then we wondered about the influence of varying scales of analysis on the results for prioritizing road sections for fencing. You already have some idea about this influence from Steffi's results. So we used Sariema, as Steffi had explained. So we have this little circle moving along the road, and then can compare the number of dead animals found compared to a random distribution of the same number of events along the road. And when the road segments have greater numbers, then we use this, identify this as a hotspot. So we used roadkill data from our earlier study along Highway 175 between Quebec City and Saguenay, and also roadkill data from 2 roads in Brazil. And we used 5 scales of analysis: 200 meters, 300 meters, 500 meters, 1,000 meters, and 2,000 meters. And with this circle, we moved along the road in steps of 100 meters. So it's called a moving window analysis. And we also compared to several confidence levels, and then created so-called mortality reduction graphs, which I will show you in a minute. So this is the output from Sariema, and same as Steffi's results, when you have those aggregation intensity values higher than the confidence interval. So you see that here, for example, you find hotspots, and when it's below, then it's a cold spot. This was done at the 90% confidence interval. If you want a higher confidence interval, you will have a bigger area in the center and fewer hotspots identified. And now, where would you put the fences? So in a classroom, I would now ask the students, make your suggestions. And of course, the right answer is you would start where you have the strongest hotspots. So let me put some fence there. This is where you put your first fence, and the next fence would go here, correct? And then you extend your fence to the next hotspots that you have identified here. So you can go step by step, and you may then ask the question, so if I do this, by how much do I actually reduce road mortality? And that's exactly the idea of these mortality reduction graphs. So on the x-axis, you add fence in the most important locations, the strongest hotspots first. So you can then reduce total roadkill that was 100% with 0 fence down to the level that is desired. For example, here, if you put fence up to this length of 57 kilometers, you would reduce the amount of roadkill down to 7 or 8% of the original roadkill, if the fence works perfectly fine, which is the assumption under which we do this. And you can also see that this works faster than just a diagonal line that would represent an equal distribution of roadkill everywhere. So now, because we start with the roadkill aggregations, we can reduce roadkill faster. For example, if we have these this pattern here of roadkill, and we fence this at the 1,000 meter scale, we would have one long section of 1,000 meters here. However, we could also analyze these hotspots at the 200 meter scale, and the result would then be we would have 3 sections of 200 meters to fence these 3 hotspots at the 200 meter scale. So that means if you fence at a larger, coarser scale, you don't reduce roadkill mortality as effectively as when you were able to reduce roadkill with short sections of fence. However, there's a price to pay, and that is that animals that live in the landscape may now move along the fence and get killed once they try to cross the road at the fence end. So that's a so-called fence end effect. So you don't want to have your fence sections too short. Maybe a minimum would be 100 or 200 meters, but if you just put a 5-meter fence, it will do nothing, right? So you can now show these mortality reduction graphs for the different scales. At 1,000 meters, you see the blue line here, that's the mortality reduction if you use sections of 1,000 meters. And at the red line would be the result for reducing roadkill at the 200-meter scale. And you see right away it's decreasing more rapidly. And for achieving the same roadkill reduction as before, down to 7 or 8%, you would now only need about 47 kilometers. So this raises the question, is it better to have a few long fences or many short fences? And we invented an acronym for this. We call it the FLOMS trade-off, because you need to consider that you want to have short sections that may be less expensive, but you also want to have fence sections long enough that you don't have a problem of the fence end effect. So you can now systematically compare these mortality reduction graphs for the 6 different scales. You can also look at the influence of the confidence levels. So if you look at the hotspots at the 99% confidence levels, these are here at the beginning. Then you have the 95% confidence level hotspots, 90%, and here even 80%, and then the cold spots at the other end. So you can study that influence as well. And then you can go back to your map and make suggestions where the fences would be placed. So here in brown, these are the new suggested fences at different scales. This is an example from Highway 175. For example, here, there exist fences length of 200 meters, and these would need to be extended to prevent in the future the roadkill that we have observed in our study there. So for the discussion, the question then is, at what scale or scales should we fence? We should find those appropriate scales according to the species we are considering and compare their mortality reduction routes. Sometimes we can also find thresholds, in particular for the roads. In Brazil, we found thresholds which may be informative for the decision about how long the fences should be. And we then need to consider this trade-off of few long or many short fences. We then put all of this together in a proposed adaptive fence implementation plan, where we start with collecting the roadkill data, then choose the scales for analysis, identify the hot spots and cold spots, decide about the target reduction in mortality, by how much we want to reduce or have to reduce mortality to make sure the populations are protected, and then fence the according sections of the roads. And then we need to keep monitoring to see whether there's a fence end effect occurring, and that's the period of adaptive management. So overall, it's important to consider the choice of scales, consider this FLOMS trade-off by comparing your various mortality reduction graphs, and then consolidate with your observed reduction in the field. And with this, I want to acknowledge very much the work of several students who did field work for roadkill surveys, Katrina Bélanger-Smith and Judith Plante, for example, and then the Ministère des Transports du Québec for funding this research. If you're interested in this, this is also published most recently in a paper in conservation biology, and I would be happy to send you that paper. Just contact me, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jochen. It was a really interesting presentation. It's really nice to see where this work has come. I have a question right away from the audience as to whether we can get copies of the reports or the PowerPoints. So you mentioned that your work is published. Can we get copies of the PowerPoints as well?
Of mine, for sure. For Steffi's, we may need to discuss that a little more. So at some point, yes, but it may need to go through some approval processes with the Transport Ministry. So it's not that obvious, but I hope that will be possible. So the best would be if you can send an email either to Steffi Veloso or to myself, and then we will share as much as we possibly can share with you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have a question right away? We are close to out of time, but we can still take a few questions. Time went very fast today. Amy, did you have a question?
Yes, but I also see something in Q&A, so I think you should take that one first.
Okay, so in the Q&A, I have a question. Has there been any attempts to measure the end of fence effect created by shorter fences? Likely species specific, but not trivial mortality, I presume.
Should I answer probably? Yes, we have published a paper last year. It's Plant et al. 2019 in the Journal of Environmental Management, where we observe the fence effect. And so we can quantify how strong it is. And there have been some suggestions, but not much so far, how to mitigate it, what the fence shape should be. Some people have done this. For example, in Banff National Park, they have at the fence end continued with the fence far into the forest, so that the animals that are within the fenced area would be forced to return back into the forest and cannot cross the road at the end. However, if you have animals that come from outside, they cannot then continue because now there's a fence and some of them might be led towards the road. So it's a little ambiguous with these shapes of the fence ends, and there's an urgent research need. So if people want to do such studies, that would be great. I think it's an important study to do.
Okay, Amy, did you have a question?
Yes, it might be a bit going on a tangent, but I'm wondering, you know, the animals are trying to cross the road for a reason. Presumably there's something on the other side. And while preventing them from crossing the road obviously prevents them from getting hit by the cars, which is fabulous. They may be denied access to whatever it was that they were trying to get to the other side for. And I wonder maybe this is just you're focusing in on the fences because you break down the problem, but have you given some thought within this team effort or the broader effort to compensating for whatever it is that is on the other side of the road?
Absolutely. So there has been quite a bit of a discussion. Do you want to say something about this first, Steffi, before I jump in?
My computer cut out like right at the end, so I actually missed the end of the question. So you can go first and I'll see if I have anything to add.
So there's a lot of discussion right now about landscape connectivity, and that is very important. However, in this discussion, sometimes road mortality gets a bit overlooked, where in fact, more recent studies have shown that road mortality is just as big a problem, if not bigger, than the connectivity that is interrupted. So I think it's important that we don't forget about road mortality, and that having those fences is a very, very important and necessary step, first of all, before we even worry too much about connectivity. It's true that connectivity is important as well, and that's why we need wildlife passages, and with the fences in place, kind of even more so. So that's why also the study is very interesting that Steffi mentioned, with cameras in the existing crossing structures that are for human use. So far, there are no wildlife passages along Highway 10 between Montreal and Sherbrooke. And our study has shown that a few species use those existing structures, but not that many. So designated wildlife passages will be necessary. And true, with the fences, it becomes more obvious that these crossing structures will be necessary. Yes.
Yeah, the idea
let me add in a little bit first. It wasn't just about connectivity, but if there's a way to replace what they can't access on the other side or compensate for it. Like if it's territory, I guess not too much, but if it's water, or for instance, or a particular type of vegetation, you know, if there's ways to try to get whatever it is that they're trying to get to on the other side available on both sides of the road.
That might be possible in very special cases, but in general, no. It's typically the phase when the young leave their parents and are forced to find a territory for themselves, the dispersal phase. So they look everywhere. They're just in search of things, and then they don't stop at the road. They would try to cross the road. It's also a tricky situation for migrating species who may have some type of habitat for the summer and some type of habitat in the winter on the other side of the road. And then moving that summer and winter habitat across the road would basically be impossible. And another argument is that species may need to shift their range northwards due to climate change, as a warming climate. And at some point they will get to this road, and making it unnecessary for them to shift would mean to stop climate warming. Yeah. Which we should do anyway, but yeah, we don't know when that will happen.
I would also like to add that Dr. Jaeger mentioned that there's currently no animal friendly like culvert passages, but actually last summer they began constructing one. So it's a fish passage, there's water in between with 2 dry shelves for medium-sized mammal on either side. It's still under construction, but as soon as they finish, we're gonna get cameras there as well to see that, because the idea really is to couple the fences with animal crossing structures so that that connectivity is established, but also more mortality is reduced, like Dr. Jaeger said.
Yeah.
We are running a little bit over time, so I'll take the one more question that I have here, which is, could you comment on how you think the installation of a crossing structure would interact with the FLOMS trade-off? i.e., do you think shorter fences become more valuable if there is a safe crossing at the fence end?
Yes, if I can just jump in, I very much agree. So that would be great to do. However, I don't know that anybody has ever studied this. So if you are in a position with a good relationship with your transport ministry and have the possibility to put some sites with just fences of a certain length, and then in other locations, fences with a crossing structure at the end, that would be fantastic. If you have a designated crossing structure, the typical situation is that you would have fences on both sides, right? And then just having fence on one side would be kind of weird. However, if you have a drainage culvert that is big enough that animals might use it, you could extend the fence until it reaches the drainage culvert rather than just end somewhere without any particular reason. So extend it further. And that might be interesting to compare then if you have a fence with a particular shape of design of the fence end compared with the fence that ends at the drainage culverts. I don't know of any study that has ever looked into this, and it would be great research to do. And I think it's urgently needed.
Okay, I have one last question and then we will have to end. So the last question is, do you have any recommendations on the use of any other technologies to alert drivers of wildlife on the road?
That's a good question. I do have some slides about this. Just a second. I think I have them here. And that is the following. Just a second, if I can share this. Because this is, has been studied, and the point is that just wildlife warning signs don't do anything, unfortunately, to reduce road mortality. They're supposed to reduce road mortality, but usually the drivers only remember for 100 meters or 200 meters that there was this wildlife sign, and then forget about it, and they, in effect, wildlife signs only reduce road mortality by 0.5% or 1%. But what would work are these animal warning systems. So this is an example from Germany, where you have fences along the road here and here, and then you have an opening here. And there are cameras that would detect animals that try to approach the road, and big warning signs that will light up if animals are detected. So if you could go a little closer, it looks like this. So this is where the animals would cross. So there's no fence here. The fence goes into the forest here. And then you have cameras up on poles. So the whole layout, do I not have it? Oh, the layout is here. Just a second. Where you have these signs before you approach the gap, and the orange lines indicate here the fences. And once an animal is detected, these signs will light up, and then the animal is supposed to cross the road from this side to the other side. And it works. It's not as effective as a wildlife overpass or big wildlife underpass, but it still is better than nothing. So it's in between the effectiveness. That's the only other one I know of.
Thank you, Jochen. With that, we are going to have to end. But if you do have other questions, you can reach Jochen at jochen.jaeger@concordia.ca, or you can contact me. You can find our contact information on the Concordia website or on the website of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. I will forward any questions that come to me. I would really like to thank both Steffi and Jochen Jaeger for their amazing work and for their really clear, comprehensive presentations today. I'd like to thank all of the people at the Force Space, Hannah and Anna and Vanessa and Doug, for all of their help and support, Amy for the support of the Research Center, and for your participation today. And of course, all of you for being here today. I invite you to come back tomorrow. We have the last in our series. Tomorrow, same place, same time, so noon. We have Charlotte Patterson talking about the inclusion of ecological connectivity in environmental impact assessment. So another slightly related topic, but a little bit different and very applicable. So we do hope that you'll join us tomorrow. And with that, I'll pass it on to you, Anna, and wish you all a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks to you as well, and Amy for being here with us. Steffi and Johan, that was wonderful to hear about your research. And speaking on behalf of all of us behind the scenes here at ForSpace, thanks as well to the audience for making the time and choosing to spend your time with us here today. We really appreciate it, and we do look forward to seeing you for the series finale tomorrow, I hope. A recording of today's event will be available on our website, which is concordia.ca/4. And it also lives on Facebook. If you're on social media, check it out and share it at CU ForSpace. On that note, thanks again, everyone. We appreciate your participation. Lovely to spend this time with you and learn something on our lunch breaks. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.
Goodbye.